I think we'll take a minute for that to come up. I really enjoyed that last presentation. That was really great. Thank you. I learned a lot, and I think it's important for us to be able to see efforts like that. It's the kind of work that I really support, and I think you know, it's important to be able to see work like this. So thank you, the organizers, for bringing in someone as knowledgeable as we saw, and thank you all for showing up too. Saturday morning or Sunday morning is a little rough for conferences, so I appreciate the fact that you're all here. It's a big audience. My background has always been out of interest of trying to understand where my home, what my home is, and the culture that I inhabit, and trying to make some sense out of it. I came out of a background of going to college in the 60s and activism at that time, and found myself really kind of compelled to really work in art in a way that said something about where my home is and the places that I found important. I've always inspired by writers and photographers and artists that deal with that, so I'm glad to be a part of a conference that is important in that way. I really began looking at this as a young photographer in the late 70s, early 80s, when I heard of a place called Mono Lake over in the Eastern Sierra. Fascinating high desert environment that wound up being threatened by water diversions, and eventually actually wound up being kind of an environmental success story, where now Mono Lake has been preserved somewhat rather than destroyed, and some of the earliest work that I did was in that area. But I grew up in the part of California that most people drive through on their way to some other place, which is the Central Valley of California, the part of the state that's visually, most people don't really go there unless they have relatives that live there. But the Central Valley is where we get our food, and I was very interested in that, as well as where I came from, again, trying to make sense of my home and my homeland. So I began this epic 11-year project, which, working with another photographer, Steve Johnson, and a writer, Gerald Haslam, we tried to understand where we came from, and also understand this whole process of agriculture within our culture. For instance, this image is called Large Corporate Farm near Bakersfield, California, which talks about the landholding patterns of the Central Valley, which is, of course, not as many small farms as we would hope, but more something about this. And unfortunately, corporate farms by themselves are not a problem. But when you have this large industry owning much of the land, there isn't really as much put back into the communities, taking care of the local communities or even of the soils themselves. So we essentially are mining the soils of the Central Valley, using them up. This is an image over one of the streets in Modesto called Water, Wealth, Contentment, Health. I guess it doesn't get any better than that. It says it all, I think, and it's something that I think is also a sign very much out of the 19th century, part of the kind of almost a way of looking at settling into a landscape in a new way, and in some ways that sign doesn't apply today. I actually do large-scale book projects, and most of the time when I'm not teaching, I'm actually out doing projects like this one I did with a writer named Gray Brecken called Farewell Promised Land. And I was locked in a car for 4 years driving all over California with Gray. And it was really a great experience because Gray's an environmental historian, a geographer from Berkeley, and so I got to see my familiar home, the place I came from, California, from his perspective, and how the landscape that we live in today obviously is not the way it used to look, or it's evolved and changed. So that evolution was partly what we traced with this project. For instance, this image is down on the Mexican-American border called the New River, which at the time was the most polluted river in the country. A large corporation set up shop just across the border and dumped their pollution into the ground, which winds up in the groundwater, which winds up in this river. And the irony here is that the river flows from Mexico into the U.S., and it's our own pollution that we're getting. So these were toxic suds that were on top of the river at the time I took the photo. And I almost gagged when at this time. It was so horrible, the smell. And yet this goes right through the community of Mexicali Valley and right through Calexico and then eventually up into the Salton Sea. It's a very sad story. So that our book wouldn't be a complete bummer, we also included stories about people that were doing some good, and I really think that's an important part of any project like this, is that it can't be just all the problems, but it has to deal with some of the solutions. And so we looked at people that were trying to restore and do projects that were of a more positive nature, and so that was a 4-year project as well. Being more relevant to our panel today, I also have found water has been one of the most important parts of living in the American West, and it's pretty fundamental. People that control the water control the wealth in many ways, and water is something that we tend to take for granted, and yet we don't think about where it comes from or where it goes. So that project of working with water in the West was something I started on my own, and then began to realize there's lots of other people, lots of other photographers working on this subject. And we gathered together then about 15 different people from all over the country that were working on photographing Western water, and we began this large collaborative project with meeting. We'd get together as a group occasionally, and we'd publish books and have exhibitions and try to produce local symposia where we'd meet with local people and really get information, feedback of a local nature, so that our work was informed by that. And that was part of this project. And this was a 10-year effort to really look at water in the West in this way. And within that time, then each of us wound up focusing on one area. And I worked with Peter Goen, a photographer, and writer Mary Webb, looking at the Truckee River, which is Western Nevada river that is actually flows through the city of Reno, Nevada, goes and divides, and part of it goes out to the ranchers of Western Nevada, and the other part goes out to the Paiute Indian Nation around Pyramid Lake in Nevada. So you have 3 very distinct populations all using this kind of doubtful river, a river that doesn't always flow. And so that part of the project then in producing the book was looking at that. For instance, this is a homes built on a floodplain right near Reno, and this is probably not a good thing, because the next time there's a big flood coming through, these will be mobile homes because they're going to not survive. And I think a lot of this shows the explosive nature of growth within the American West sometimes produces bad policy in terms of allowing this type of thing to happen. This is a lake nearby Pyramid Lake that's a Winnemucca dry lake. Now, it's a lake that has been at one point a very rich bird sanctuary and wildlife refuge, but has dried up because of the water policy. So we spent really a long time, I think about 4 years as well, working on that, trying to understand that water, the war over water, in this case over the Truckee River, and again, a very, very interesting resource, very important for me to look at that.